Letting my husband's ex into our house that night destroyed everything, just not in the way she planned. My husband had been acting strange for 2 weeks, coming home late, checking his phone constantly, smiling at the screen in that specific way that made my stomach twist. When I confronted him, he said his ex Gabrielle had been texting. Nothing serious, just catching up. She was in town for work and wanted to apologize for how things ended between them 8 years ago. I should have said no. I should have trusted my instincts. But my husband insisted it would give him closure. He said it would help him move forward completely. So I agreed. Against every warning signal my body was sending. Gabrielle arrived at 7 with a bottle of expensive wine and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was polished, confident, everything I'd imagined during sleepless nights. She complimented our house, our wedding photos, asked thoughtful questions about my teaching job. For the first hour, I actually relaxed. Maybe I'd been wrong about her intentions. Then she started reminiscing. Remember when we drove to Portland for your birthday? Remember that ridiculous argument about the restaurant? Remember the way you always ordered for me? My husband laughed at memories I wasn't part of. I poured myself more wine, trying to ignore the growing knot in my chest. Around 9, Gabrielle excused herself to the bathroom. She was gone for 12 minutes. I'd been counting, watching the clock above the mantel, wondering what was taking so long. When she returned, she seemed lighter somehow, satisfied, like she'd accomplished something. They left together at 10, just walking her to her car, my husband said. He came back 15 minutes later, his expression unreadable. I asked if everything was okay. He said yes, but wouldn't meet my eyes. Over the next 3 days, everything unraveled. My principal called me into her office. There'd been an anonymous complaint. Someone claimed I'd been drinking during school hours, that they'd seen me stumbling in the parking lot. It wasn't true. I'd never drink at work, but they'd found an empty vodka bottle in my classroom closet. Security footage showed me entering early that morning, though I couldn't remember putting anything there. The timestamp was exactly when I arrived, but the angle made it impossible to see what I was carrying. The school board launched an investigation. My union rep asked if I had enemies, anyone who might want to damage my career. I thought of Gabrielle's 12-minute bathroom trip, her satisfied smile, the way she'd asked so many questions about my work, about my schedule, about which door I used to enter the building. My husband defended her. You're being paranoid. Why would she do that? She apologized and left, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. Then my bank called. Someone had attempted to access my account using my credentials. The IP address traced to a coffee shop 2 blocks from my school. My social media accounts were hacked. Posts appeared that I never wrote, claiming I was unhappy in my marriage, that I'd made a mistake. Screenshots circulated among parents at school. My reputation was collapsing. I checked our home security footage from that night. During those 12 minutes, Gabrielle hadn't gone to the bathroom. She'd gone upstairs to my office. I watched her sit at my computer, type rapidly, then photograph documents on my desk, my teaching license, my bank statements, everything she needed. When I showed my husband, his face went pale. That's when he finally admitted the truth. Gabrielle hadn't just wanted closure. She wanted revenge for their breakup 8 years ago, and she blamed me for it, even though I'd never met him until 3 years after they split. My husband confessed everything. They'd dated for 5 years. He'd broken up with her after catching her cheating with his best friend. She'd begged for another chance, sent hundreds of texts, showed up at his workplace. Eventually, she'd moved to another state for a fresh start, or so he thought. Now it was clear she'd been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy the life he'd built without her. The school board placed me on administrative leave pending investigation. Without my income, we couldn't afford our mortgage. My husband picked up extra shifts, but it wasn't enough. The stress fractured us. He felt guilty for letting her into our home. I felt angry that he'd kept the full extent of their toxic relationship from me. We stopped talking about anything real, communicating only in logistics and necessities. Then the lawyer bills started arriving. I needed legal representation to fight the school board's allegations. My union covered some costs, but not everything. We drained our savings, sold my car. I applied for jobs at other schools, but word had spread. No one wanted to hire a teacher under investigation for drinking on campus, even though the charges were fabricated. Meanwhile, Gabrielle had disappeared. No social media presence, no forwarding address. The police said without concrete proof she'd planted the evidence, they couldn't pursue charges. The security footage from our home showed her in my office, but not what she'd done. My computer log showed someone had accessed my accounts that night, but a good lawyer could argue I'd done it myself and blamed her later. I became obsessed with finding proof. I hired a private investigator using money borrowed from my brother. 3 weeks later, he found something. Gabrielle had done this before. To another woman in Seattle, her ex-boyfriend's new wife. That woman had lost her nursing license after anonymous complaints, and mysterious evidence appeared. She'd tried to prove Gabrielle's involvement, but couldn't. Her marriage had collapsed under the pressure. She'd moved back in with her parents, started over from nothing. I contacted her immediately. Her name was Petra, and when I explained what happened, she started crying. I thought I was crazy, she said. Everyone told me I was paranoid, but I knew it was her. We compared notes. The patterns were identical. The bathroom disappearance, the 12-minute window, the perfectly timed complaints, the untraceable digital manipulation. Gabrielle had refined her methods with practice. Together, we built a case. Petra had kept everything from her ordeal. Screenshots, emails, witness statements. Combined with my evidence, we had a pattern of behavior. I took it to a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases. She was interested but cautious. This would be expensive, lengthy, and difficult to win. Gabrielle was smart. She'd covered her tracks well. My husband and I were barely speaking by then. The financial strain had exposed cracks in our foundation. He resented me for obsessing over Gabrielle instead of moving on. I resented him for bringing her into our lives. One night, after another fight about money, he said something that changed everything. Maybe we should just accept that this is our life now. Maybe we need to let it go and start over. I realized then that he'd given up. He was ready to walk away from our home, my career, everything we'd built, rather than keep fighting. I wasn't. The next morning, I moved into my brother's spare room. My husband didn't try to stop me. He said he understood, that maybe some space would help. But we both knew what it really meant. Living at my brother's house, I had time to think clearly for the first time in months. I'd been so focused on clearing my name that I'd forgotten why I'd become a teacher in the first place. I loved helping kids learn. I loved watching them grow. That passion had gotten lost somewhere between lawyer meetings and bank statements. My brother's daughter, my niece Violet, was struggling with reading. She was 8 and falling behind in school. Her parents had hired tutors, but nothing clicked. One afternoon, I sat with her and used a different approach. Something tactile, creative. Within an hour, she was reading at level. My brother watched from the doorway, amazed. "You still have it," he said. "Whatever makes you good at this. Don't let her take that from you." That night, I started a small tutoring business from my brother's dining room. Word spread quickly. Parents who knew me from my teaching days trusted me with their kids. Within 2 months, I had 15 regular students and a waiting list. The income wasn't what I'd made teaching, but it was enough to start paying back my debts. The school board's investigation dragged on for 8 months. In the end, they couldn't substantiate the allegations. The vodka bottle had no fingerprints. The anonymous complaint came from an untraceable burner phone. They offered to reinstate me, but the damage was done. I'd seen how quickly the system could turn against someone without proof or protection. I declined their offer and focused on building my tutoring practice instead. My husband and I filed for divorce after a year of separation. It was amicable, sad, the death of something that might have survived under different circumstances. He apologized again for Gabrielle, for not believing me sooner, for giving up when things got hard. I apologized too, for letting the obsession consume me, for not fighting harder for us while fighting to clear my name. The house sold at a loss. We split what little remained after paying the mortgage and legal fees. He moved to another state for a fresh start with his company. I stayed, determined not to let Gabrielle chase me away from the city I loved. My tutoring business grew. I hired 2 other teachers who'd left the public school system. We rented a small office space and officially became a learning center. 2 years after that night, Gabrielle walked into my house. I received an email from Petra. She'd hired her own private investigator, someone more experienced and expensive than mine. He'd found something incredible. Gabrielle had a criminal record from 15 years ago under a different name, identity fraud. She'd stolen someone's credentials to get into graduate school. She'd been caught and convicted but had changed her name after serving probation. This changed everything. The lawyer I'd worked with before agreed to take the case. With Gabrielle's history of identity fraud, we could argue a pattern of malicious deception. Petra and I filed a joint civil suit for damages. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Defamation. Interference with business relationships. The sum we requested was substantial, enough to cover all our losses and legal fees. Gabrielle tried to hide. She'd moved again, this time to Texas. But the investigator found her working under her real name at a marketing firm. When she was served, she hired a lawyer who immediately tried to settle. They offered $15,000 to make it go away. We refused. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about stopping her from doing this to someone else. The case went to trial 18 months later. The courtroom was small, clinical. Gabrielle sat across from us looking older than her years, diminished somehow. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a woman struggling with mental health issues, someone who'd made mistakes but deserved compassion. Our lawyer presented the evidence methodically. The pattern across 3 victims now. We'd found a 3rd woman in Austin with an identical story. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, they'd ruled in our favor. The judgment was for $340,000 split between 3 victims. Gabrielle's lawyer filed an appeal, but it was denied. The judge had seen enough. He ordered her to pay and mandated she undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. If she violated the terms, she'd face criminal charges for harassment. Collecting the money took another year. Gabrielle's assets were limited. She'd spent most of her savings on lawyers. We received payments in installments, garnished from her wages. It wasn't the full amount, but it was something. More importantly, she was in the system now. If she tried this again, there would be consequences. With my share of the settlement, I paid off my remaining debts and invested in expanding the learning center. We moved to a larger space, hired 3 more teachers. Word had spread about what happened to me, and parents appreciated that I understood how quickly circumstances could change. Our center became known for working with students who'd struggled in traditional settings. My ex-husband reached out once during this time. He'd heard about the trial outcome through mutual friends. He said he was proud of me for not giving up, that he should have believed me from the start. I thanked him and meant it. There was no anger left, just a quiet acknowledgement that we'd both done our best in an impossible situation. 5 years after that dinner, I was invited to speak at a teachers' conference about rebuilding after a professional crisis. I almost declined. Talking about that period still brought up complicated emotions. But my niece Violet, now 13 and thriving, convinced me. She said my story mattered, that other people needed to know they could survive something similar. Standing on that stage, looking at hundreds of educators, I told the truth about the dinner, the 12 minutes, the vodka bottle, the collapse of everything I'd worked for, but also about what came after, the tutoring business, the learning center, the lawsuit, the slow, difficult process of rebuilding. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. Afterward, dozens of people approached with their own stories, teachers who'd been falsely accused, professionals destroyed by vindictive ex-partners, people who'd lost everything and didn't know how to start over. I collected their contact information and started an informal support network, monthly meetings where people could share resources, legal advice, emotional support. Within a year, it had grown to over 200 members across 3 states. We called it Phoenix Collective. Rising from ashes felt appropriate. My learning center continued growing. We opened a second location, then a third. I hired teachers who'd been pushed out of traditional systems for reasons beyond their control, people who understood that one false accusation could derail everything. Our staff had a depth of empathy that came from lived experience. One afternoon, I was reviewing applications for a 4th location when I saw a familiar name, Gabrielle. She'd applied for an administrative position under her legal name, apparently unaware it was my company. I stared at that application for 20 minutes, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to reject it immediately, but another part was curious. Had she changed? Was she still the person who'd destroyed lives for sport? I called my lawyer. She advised against any contact. Too risky, too complicated. But I couldn't let it go. I did a background check, which I would have done anyway. She'd been working steadily for the past 3 years at a nonprofit. Her references were solid. Her skills matched what we needed. On paper, she was qualified. I consulted with Petra, who'd become a close friend. She was furious. "Don't even consider it," she said. "She'll destroy you again. She'll find a way." And maybe that was true. But I kept thinking about the judge's mandate. Psychiatric evaluation and treatment. What if she'd actually gotten help? What if people could change? I didn't hire her, but I did something I never thought I would. I called her, the number on her application. When she answered, there was a long silence after I said my name. Then she started crying. Not manipulative tears, but deep, wrenching sobs. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. I was sick. I was so angry and sick, and I didn't know how to stop." We talked for 2 hours. She told me about the therapy, the medications, the slow realization of what she'd done to people who'd never hurt her. She'd tried to reach out before, but her lawyer advised against it during the appeal. She'd written letters she never sent, apologies she didn't know how to deliver. Seeing my company name on the job listing had felt like fate, a chance to somehow make amends, even if I never knew she was there. I told her I couldn't hire her, that the risk was too great, not just for me, but for my staff who'd survived their own traumas. She understood. She said she just wanted me to know she was trying to be better, that she lived with the shame of what she'd done every single day. We hung up, and I sat in my office crying for an hour. I never spoke to her again. But 6 months later, I received a letter. She'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping survivors of domestic abuse rebuild their lives. She'd disclosed her own history to the director, who'd given her a chance. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or contact. She just wanted me to know she was trying to use her skills to help instead of harm. The letter included a check for $8,000, everything she'd managed to save beyond her court-mandated payments. "I'm not expecting you to cash this," she wrote, "but I needed to offer. I did cash it. And I donated it to Phoenix Collective in her name, not because she deserved recognition, but because the money could help people she'd hurt." The director of our support network asked about the donation. I told her the full story. She was skeptical. "People like that don't change," she said. Maybe not. But the money was real. The work she was doing at the shelter was real. And I'd spent too many years consumed by anger to hold on to it if I didn't have to. My learning center thrived. We opened 2 more locations over the next 3 years. I developed curriculum specifically for students recovering from trauma, academic or otherwise. My staff became experts in recognizing signs of distress, in creating safe spaces for learning. We partnered with therapists who worked with our students at reduced rates. Violet graduated high school with honors and decided to study education. She wanted to teach at our center after college. Watching her grow into someone passionate about helping others, I realized that maybe the whole nightmare had led somewhere meaningful. Not that it was worth it. The pain never balanced out. But something good had grown from the ruins. My ex-husband remarried. I heard through friends. Someone he'd met at his new job. Someone with no connection to our past. I felt happy for him. Genuinely. He deserved peace after everything. We'd both been collateral damage in someone else's vendetta. Neither of us had deserved it, and both of us had survived. 10 years after that dinner, Phoenix Collective had expanded nationally, over 3,000 members. We'd successfully lobbied for better protections for professionals facing false allegations, mandatory investigations before terminations, better documentation requirements. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. People reached out constantly, desperate for guidance. We'd created resource packets, legal referrals, counseling networks. What started as a small support group had become a movement. I was invited to testify before a congressional committee about workplace harassment and false allegations. Standing in that chamber telling my story to lawmakers felt surreal. A decade earlier, I'd been sleeping on my brother's couch, wondering if I'd ever work again. Now I was influencing policy that could protect others from similar fates. The Learning Center had grown to 15 locations across 6 states. We employed over 100 people, served thousands of students annually. I'd written a book about rebuilding after professional destruction that became required reading in several education programs. Speaking engagements filled my calendar. I barely recognized my life anymore. But success didn't erase what happened. Some nights I still dreamed about that dinner, Gabrielle's smile, the 12 minutes, my husband's face when he realized what she'd done, the sensation of my entire life crumbling. Those memories lived in my body, triggered by unexpected moments. A certain perfume, wine in a specific bottle, the sound of someone using a bathroom upstairs. I went to therapy regularly, learned about complex trauma, about how violation doesn't just damage in the moment, but rewires how you experience safety. I'd become hypervigilant about who entered my space. Background checks on everyone, cameras everywhere. My therapist said it was normal after what I'd experienced. That healing wasn't linear. Some weeks I felt powerful, invincible. Others, I felt like that terrified woman watching security footage, realizing how thoroughly she'd been destroyed. My brother's family remained my anchor. Violet started working at the Learning Center during college breaks. She had a gift for connecting with struggling students. My brother said I'd given her that, shown her what resilience looked like. But really, she'd saved me, giving me a place to stay, a reason to keep fighting, a reminder that good people still existed. One afternoon, I received an email from a journalist. She was writing about women who'd weaponized false allegations against romantic rivals. She'd heard about my case and wanted an interview. I almost deleted it. I'd moved on, built something beautiful from the ashes. Did I want to revisit that darkness publicly? But then I thought about the messages I received weekly, people whose lives were currently being destroyed, who felt alone and crazy, who needed to know survival was possible. I agreed to the interview. When the article published, it went viral. Millions of reads, thousands of comments. Some people called me brave. Others said I was exaggerating, that women don't do things like that. Their dismissal proved exactly why we needed to keep speaking. The attention brought new challenges. Trolls found my social media. Strangers dissected my choices, questioned why I'd let her in, blamed me for not seeing it coming. My staff worried about my safety. We hired security for the Learning Center. The price of visibility was constant vulnerability. But the messages of gratitude outnumbered the hate 10 to 1. People whose allegations were believed because of the conversation we'd started. People who found Phoenix Collective and received support during their darkest moments. 15 years after that dinner, I was living a life I'd never imagined. Successful beyond measure. Surrounded by people I'd helped, who'd helped me. But I still carried the scars. Still flinched when someone asked to use my bathroom. Still did background checks compulsively. Still woke up some nights convinced I'd lost everything again. My therapist said, maybe I always would. That trauma changes you permanently. But change isn't always destruction. I'd become someone stronger, wiser, more compassionate. Someone who understood that the worst moments could become catalysts for the best work. That surviving something terrible gave you a responsibility to help others survive too. The Learning Center continued growing. Phoenix Collective expanded internationally. I published a second book, this time about building community after crisis. My speaking fees funded scholarships for students at our centers. I'd created something sustainable, something that would outlast me, something good that existed because something terrible had happened first. I never married again. Dated occasionally, but couldn't quite trust that way anymore. Maybe someday. My therapist said I shouldn't force it. That being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, and mostly, I wasn't. I had my work, my staff, Violet and her siblings, Phoenix Collective members who'd become family, a life rich with purpose and connection. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd said no that night, if I'd trusted my instincts, if my husband had never reconnected with Gabrielle. Would we still be married? Would I still be teaching? Would I be happier? There was no way to know. This was the life I had, shaped by choices and circumstances beyond my control. I could only decide what to do with it. Looking back now, I understood something I couldn't have grasped in the midst of crisis. Gabrielle hadn't destroyed everything. She'd destroyed one version of my life, but that created space for something else. Something I'd built deliberately, with clear intention. My teaching job had been good, but not passionate. My marriage had been comfortable, but not transformative. The life I'd lost was fine. The life I'd built was purposeful. That didn't make what she did acceptable. The ends never justified the means. But it meant I could acknowledge the complexity. That trauma had damaged me, and also changed me in ways that led somewhere meaningful. Both things were true. I carried the wounds and the wisdom, the fear and the courage, the loss and the growth. 20 years after that night, I was invited back to my old school. They'd renamed the Teacher Appreciation Award in my honor. I stood in the gymnasium where I'd once taught, surrounded by educators who'd heard my story. The principal apologized formally for the investigation, for not believing me. Better late than never, but the apology felt hollow. The damage was done. I accepted it with grace, then gave a speech about the importance of protecting teachers from false allegations. Afterward, my former colleagues approached with tears. We should have supported you more, they said. We were scared. We didn't know what to believe. I understood. Fear made people self-protective, but their silence had cost me dearly. Forgiveness was complicated. I could appreciate their regret without absolving their inaction. Both were true. The award ceremony featured testimonials from teachers I'd mentored, students I'd taught. One girl, now in college, credited me with believing in her when no one else had. She'd been struggling with learning disabilities, falling behind in every subject. I'd spent extra hours with her after school, finding ways to help her understand concepts that traditional methods hadn't reached. Now she was studying to become a special education teacher. Stories like hers reminded me why I'd fought so hard to stay in education, even when the system had rejected me. My brother attended the ceremony with his whole family. Violet stood beside him, now 28, and running her own satellite location of our learning center. She'd surpassed me in so many ways, bringing innovation and energy I no longer had. Watching her work with struggling students, I saw myself 20 years earlier, but better, unburdened by the trauma that had shaped my approach. She could simply teach, love kids, make a difference. She didn't carry the hypervigilance that never left me. After the ceremony, an older teacher approached. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Delacroix had been my mentor during my first year of teaching, the person who'd shown me how to manage a classroom and connect with difficult students. She'd retired 5 years before everything fell apart. When she heard what happened, she'd called me repeatedly. I'd never answered. I should have done more, she said, her voice breaking. I should have come to the school board meetings, testified on your behalf, made them see who you really were. I told her it was okay, that her calls had mattered even though I couldn't return them, that knowing someone believed me had helped during the darkest moments. She hugged me tightly, and I felt something release, a piece of anger I hadn't realized I still carried. The drive home that night took me past the house where it all happened. New owners had painted it blue and added a fence. I slowed down, staring at the windows where Gabrielle had looked out that night before leaving, where my husband and I had fought about money and blame and whether our marriage could survive, where I'd watched security footage and understood how completely I'd been violated. The house looked peaceful now, happy, like nothing terrible had ever happened there. I wondered if the new owners knew the history, if someone had told them about the teacher who'd lost everything because of one dinner. Probably not. Houses don't carry their stories forward. Only the people who lived through them do. I drove on, leaving the blue house behind, heading toward the apartment I'd owned for the past decade. Small but comfortable, full of books and plants and evidence of a life rebuilt carefully, piece by piece. Gabrielle died 3 years later. I learned through a brief email from Petra. Ovarian cancer. She'd been sick for months, but hadn't told anyone. No funeral, no obituary. She'd died alone in a hospice facility. The end of a life defined by damage. I felt a complicated grief. Not for who she was, but for who she could have been, for the waste of it all. I never told anyone but my therapist, but I cried that night. For her, for me, for everyone caught in the destruction, for the years I'd spent afraid, looking over my shoulder, for the marriage that ended, for the woman who'd hurt so many people because she couldn't stop hurting. The crying lasted hours, purging something I'd carried for decades. Petra called the next day. She'd heard about Gabrielle's death and wanted to check on me. We talked for an hour about forgiveness and justice and whether any of it mattered once someone was gone. Petra said she felt relieved, that finally she could stop worrying about Gabrielle showing up in her life again. I understood that relief, but I also felt sad in a way I couldn't articulate, maybe because death made everything final. There was no possibility of further change, of redemption, of anything beyond the damage already done. Phoenix Collective held a private discussion about Gabrielle's death. Some members felt vindicated, others felt cheated out of the confrontation they'd never had. A few felt genuine sadness. We talked about how to process the death of someone who'd traumatized us, whether we owed them anything, whether their suffering mattered. The conversation went on for 3 hours, everyone bringing their own complicated feelings. One woman said something that stayed with me. She said she hoped Gabrielle had found peace at the end. Not because Gabrielle deserved it, but because holding on to anger at a dead person felt like punishment we inflicted on ourselves. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed, about what I owed Gabrielle's memory, about whether I could let go of the remaining bitterness now that she was gone. My Learning Center network reached 30 locations by year 22. Phoenix Collective served over 10,000 members globally. I'd been profiled in major publications, given keynote speeches at international conferences, but the work I was most proud of was quieter. The individual students who thrived, the teachers who found new careers, the professionals who rebuilt after allegations, the one-on-one moments where someone said you helped me survive. One of those moments came unexpectedly during a routine parent-teacher conference. A mother broke down crying while discussing her daughter's progress. The woman said she'd lost her job 2 years earlier after false harassment allegations. She'd been too ashamed to tell anyone, isolating herself and falling into depression. Then she'd found Phoenix Collective through our website. She'd connected with other survivors, received legal advice, and eventually found new work. Now she could afford tutoring for her daughter. She wanted me to know that saving her daughter's education was only possible because I'd saved her first. Stories like that kept me going during difficult moments. When the work felt overwhelming, when trolls attacked online, when I woke up from nightmares about that dinner, I reminded myself that the pain had purpose, that every person we helped justified what we'd survived. Violet took over as director of the flagship learning center when I turned 55. She'd earned a master's in education and specialized in trauma-informed teaching. Watching her lead, I felt pride so intense it physically hurt. She was everything I'd hoped to become before that night changed everything. She had my passion, but without my scars. She could trust more freely, love more openly. She represented what could grow when someone survived and chose to build something beautiful. The transition wasn't easy. I'd controlled every aspect of the Learning Center for 2 decades. Letting go required acknowledging that my way wasn't the only way. that younger people had ideas I hadn't considered, that my trauma sometimes made me too cautious, too protective. Violet was bolder, willing to take risks I couldn't stomach, and she was right more often than not. Her approach attracted new students and staff energized by her vision. I stepped back, but didn't disappear. I still taught one class weekly, working with students who'd experienced trauma. These sessions were small, intimate. We rarely discussed the trauma directly. Instead, we built trust slowly through literature and art and conversation. I shared pieces of my story when it seemed helpful. Let them know survival was possible, that bad things happening didn't define who you'd become. One student, a 15-year-old named Iris, had been removed from her home after her stepfather was arrested for fraud. The family business collapsed, and suddenly she went from private school and stability to living with her grandmother in subsidized housing. She was angry, grieving the life she'd lost. During one session, she asked if I ever stopped being angry about what happened to me. I told her the truth. That anger came in waves. Some days it was background noise, barely noticeable. Other days it consumed me completely. But over time, the waves got smaller and further apart. That didn't mean forgetting or accepting what happened. It meant making space for other emotions too. Joy and hope and satisfaction in what I'd built. Iris nodded, not entirely convinced but willing to consider it. 6 months later, she wrote me a letter saying she decided to study business, that she wanted to help families like hers recover from financial fraud. That anger could become fuel if you directed it correctly. My brother's health declined when he turned 60. Diabetes complications. He'd always been the strong one, the person I leaned on during the worst years. Seeing him vulnerable shocked me. I started visiting more frequently, helping with medical appointments and medication management. His wife worked full-time and couldn't always be there, so I stepped in, repaying decades of support. One afternoon while waiting for his doctor, he said something that surprised me. He told me he'd always felt guilty about what happened, that if he'd been more involved in my life, maybe he would have noticed the warning signs. Maybe he could have stopped me from letting Gabrielle into the house. I told him that was ridiculous, that I'd made my own choices. But he shook his head. He said watching me suffer had been the hardest thing he'd ever experienced. Harder than his own health problems. Harder than anything. I realized then that my trauma had rippled outward, affecting everyone who loved me. My brother carried guilt. My ex-husband carried regret. My colleagues carried shame for not supporting me. Violet carried a sense of responsibility to honor what I'd survived. The damage didn't stop with me. It spread like a stain, touching everyone in its path. That night, I called a therapist I'd worked with years earlier. I told her about this realization. She said it was common for trauma survivors to eventually recognize the secondary effects. That understanding this didn't mean taking responsibility for others' feelings, but it did mean acknowledging the full scope of what had been damaged. Not just me, but an entire network of relationships and trust. Phoenix Collective started offering support for secondary trauma victims, family members of people who'd been falsely accused, friends who didn't know how to help, colleagues who'd witnessed someone's destruction and felt helpless. The need was immediate and overwhelming. Turns out, for every person directly traumatized, there were 10 others carrying secondary wounds. We created resources, facilitated discussions, connected people who understood. My ex-husband reached out again around this time. He'd heard about the secondary trauma programming and wanted to participate. We met for coffee, the first time we'd seen each other in person in over a decade. He looked older, grayer, tired, but also more settled than I remembered. He'd remarried, had a stepson, built a stable life, but he said he still carried guilt about what happened, that he should have protected me better, should have known what Gabrielle was capable of. I told him what my therapist had helped me understand, that he couldn't have known, that even I hadn't seen it coming and I was generally more suspicious than him. That blame wasn't useful anymore. We'd both done our best with incomplete information. Sometimes that wasn't enough. Sometimes terrible things happened despite everyone's best intentions. He cried then, quietly, and I realized this was the closure we'd never gotten during the divorce. Not forgiveness exactly. More like mutual recognition of shared suffering. 25 years after that dinner, I was invited to speak at a national conference on trauma recovery. The audience included therapists, educators, lawyers, and survivors. I'd given hundreds of speeches by then, but this one felt different. Maybe because it marked a quarter century. Maybe because I was finally at a place where I could discuss it without the raw emotion that had defined earlier years. I told the whole story, start to finish. The dinner, the investigation, the divorce, the lawsuit, the rebuilding. I didn't soften the hard parts or exaggerate the victories. Just the truth of how one night had detonated my life and what I'd done with the aftermath. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, then another. Soon the entire audience was standing, applauding, not for my suffering, but for what I'd built from it. Afterward, a woman in her 30s approached. She said her sister had been falsely accused of theft at work 3 years ago. Security footage later proved her innocence, but she'd already lost her job and reputation. She'd attempted suicide twice. She was currently in intensive therapy, barely functional. The woman wanted to know if her sister would ever recover, if life could ever feel normal again. I didn't lie to her. I said recovery looked different for everyone, that some people found their way back to stability quickly, others struggled for years or decades, that there was no timeline, no guaranteed outcome. But I also told her about Phoenix Collective, about resources available, about other survivors who'd walked similar paths and might help her sister feel less alone. The woman wrote down everything, tears streaming down her face. She thanked me 5 times before leaving. That conversation stayed with me for days. The desperation in her eyes, the love for her sister, and helplessness about how to save her. I thought about how many families were experiencing similar pain right now. How many people were in the thick of trauma, unable to imagine a future where things felt manageable. I'd been there once. Maybe I was still there in some ways, but I'd also found a path forward. That had to count for something. On the 25th anniversary of that dinner, I wrote a final essay. Not for publication, just for myself. An accounting of what was lost and found. My marriage, my teaching career, my savings, my sense of safety. Those were gone, irretrievable. But I'd gained purpose, community, wisdom, strength. I'd learned that people could survive almost anything, that institutions would fail you, that justice was imperfect but worth pursuing, that trauma changed you but didn't have to define you. I also wrote about Gabrielle, about how I'd spent years angry, then years processing, and finally arrived at something closer to understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, she'd never earned that, but recognition that hurt people. That mental illness explained without excusing, that her death marked the end of a sad story that had intersected with mine and left us both changed. The essay ended with the thing I'd learned most powerfully, that letting her into my house that night had destroyed everything, just not in the way she planned. She'd meant to ruin me. Instead, she'd forced me to rebuild deliberately, to create something aligned with my deepest values, to become someone I'd never have become otherwise. The worst night of my life had paradoxically led to my best work. That didn't make it worth it, but it meant something. It meant I could look back without only seeing loss. I could see transformation, and that made all the difference. I put the essay in a drawer, not ready to share it yet. Maybe someday. For now, it was enough to have written it, to have sorted through 25 years of memories and emotions and found some coherent meaning. That felt like progress, like I'd finally integrated the trauma into my life story, rather than letting it dominate everything. Violet got engaged that year, to another teacher she'd met at a conference, someone kind and stable and wholly supportive of her work. Watching them together reminded me of what healthy love looked like, what my marriage might have been without Gabrielle's interference. I felt happy for Violet, and only slightly bitter about what I'd lost. That ratio felt like victory. The wedding was beautiful, simple, and joyful. Violet asked me to give a toast, and I struggled with what to say, how to honor her happiness without mentioning the darkness that had shaped both our lives. Eventually, I talked about resilience, about how watching her grow from a struggling 8-year-old reader into a confident educator had taught me more about human capacity than any research study could, that she represented hope in its purest form, that I was grateful every day to know her. People cried, including me, but they were good tears, the kind that came from overwhelming gratitude rather than grief. My brother's health stabilized with new treatments. He'd never be healthy exactly, but he was functional, able to enjoy his grandchildren and travel occasionally and live without constant crisis. I visited weekly, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine. Lunch, then a walk if he felt strong enough. Sometimes we talked about the past. Other times we just existed together peacefully. He told me once that having me around made him feel safer, that knowing I'd fought through hell and survived made his own health struggles feel manageable. I understood that. We were mirrors for each other, proof that bad things happened, but didn't have to be endings. Phoenix Collective celebrated its 15th anniversary with a gala fundraiser. Over 1,000 people attended. Survivors, supporters, donors. We raised enough money to fund operations for 2 years and expand our services to 3 new countries. Standing on that stage, looking at faces of people I'd helped and people who'd helped me, I felt something close to peace. Not complete, maybe never complete, but enough. The keynote speaker was Petra. She'd become a national advocate for victims of false allegations, testifying before legislative bodies and appearing on news programs. Her life had followed a parallel trajectory to mine. Destruction, then deliberate reconstruction. She talked about how meeting me had changed everything, how knowing she wasn't alone had given her strength to keep fighting. We'd saved each other in ways neither of us could have predicted. That seemed important to acknowledge. During the reception, a young woman approached nervously. She was 19, a college student. She said she'd been following my work since high school, that her mother had been falsely accused of embezzlement when the young woman was 12, that watching her mother survive had shaped everything about how she understood strength and resilience. Now she was studying law, specifically focused on defending people facing false allegations. She wanted me to know my story had helped her mother and, by extension, had helped her. I hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by the ripple effects. The way trauma and recovery both spread outward, touching people I'd never meet. 30 years after that dinner, I was 62 years old. The Learning Center network had grown to 50 locations across 12 states. Phoenix Collective served over 20,000 members worldwide. I'd published 4 books and countless articles. My work had influenced policy changes in 8 states. But more than any of that, I'd survived. I'd taken the absolute worst thing that ever happened to me and built something beautiful from the ruins. Some days I still woke up angry, still thought about Gabrielle and what she took from me, still mourned my marriage and my teaching career and the version of myself that existed before that night. But those days were rarer now. Most mornings I woke up grateful for my work, for the people whose lives had improved because of resources we provided. For Violet and her children, for my brother and his family, for every small moment of joy I'd fought so hard to reclaim. I started mentoring younger trauma survivors, people in the early stages of rebuilding. They needed to hear that it got better, that the raw, consuming pain eventually became manageable, that they could build lives worth living even after devastating loss. I told them what I wished someone had told me during those first dark months, that healing wasn't linear, that some parts of them might always carry the damage, but that they were more than their trauma, that they could choose what came next. One woman I mentored, Celeste, had lost her medical license after false allegations from a colleague. She was suicidal when we first met, convinced her life was over. I sat with her through the worst of it, helped her find legal representation, connected her with other doctors who'd survived similar situations, watched as she slowly, painfully, began to believe recovery was possible. 3 years later, she got her license reinstated and opened a practice specializing in treating other healthcare workers with trauma. She told me I'd saved her life. I told her she'd saved herself. I just held space while she found her way through the darkness. My ex-husband and I maintained occasional contact, friendly but distant. He'd had 2 more children with his second wife. I saw photos on social media sometimes. They looked happy, really happy. Part of me felt jealous of the life he'd built, the family and stability and peace. But mostly I felt glad one of us had gotten a conventional happy ending. Someone should have. The universe owed us that much. I never remarried, never came close. A few relationships over the years, but nothing that stuck. My therapist said I had attachment issues stemming from the betrayal. That trusting someone completely felt impossible after experiencing such violation. She was right. I'd made peace with solitude, built a rich life that didn't require a partner. But sometimes late at night, I wondered what it would feel like to fully trust someone again, to let down all defenses and believe they wouldn't hurt me. It seemed impossible, like describing a color I'd never seen. Violet had her first child when I was 64, a daughter named Hope. The name made me cry when she told me. She said she wanted her daughter to carry forward the most important lesson I'd taught her. That hope wasn't naive optimism. It was deliberate, defiant insistence that better was possible even when everything suggested otherwise. That hope was a choice you made every day, especially on the days it felt stupid to choose it. Holding baby Hope for the first time, I felt something shift. This tiny person represented a future untouched by the trauma that had defined my generation of the family. She'd grow up knowing the story, understanding what her grandmother had survived, but she wouldn't carry the wounds. She could just be, live freely, make mistakes without everything collapsing. That felt like redemption somehow. My brother died when I was 66, peacefully, in his sleep. A good death if such a thing existed. At his funeral, I gave the eulogy and talked about how he'd saved me, given me a place to stay when I had nothing, believed in me when everyone else thought I was crazy, shown me what unconditional love looked like. I told the story of how he'd watched me tutor Violet and said I still had it, that those words had sparked everything that came after, that his faith in me had been the foundation I'd built my recovery on. After he died, I realized I was the last of my generation. My parents had passed years earlier, my ex-husband's parents too. I was alone in a way I'd never been before, the sole keeper of memories that no one else shared. It felt isolating and profound, like I was responsible for carrying forward everything my family had been. I started writing more seriously then, not just about the trauma, but about everything that came before. My childhood, my parents, the version of me that existed before Gabrielle, preserving it all before it disappeared completely. Phoenix Collective's 30th anniversary approached. We planned a massive conference bringing together survivors, advocates, researchers, policymakers. Over 5,000 people registered. The scope of what we'd built was staggering, from a small support group meeting in church basements to an international organization influencing legislation and social policy. I could barely wrap my mind around it. The opening keynote was mine. I stood before thousands of people and told the story one more time, but now with 3 decades of perspective. I talked about the dinner, the investigation, the divorce, the rebuilding, but I also talked about what came after. The Learning Center, Phoenix Collective, the policies we'd changed, the lives we'd touched, the ripple effects of choosing to transform trauma into purpose. When I finished, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. People were crying. I was crying. It felt like witnessing the full arc of something that had started in absolute darkness and ended in light. That night, unable to sleep, I walked around the conference center reading name tags. So many survivors. So many stories of loss and rebuilding. I stopped to talk with dozens of people. Each had their own version of that dinner. The moment everything changed, the violation that detonated their lives. But they'd all survived. They'd all found ways forward. That seemed like the most important thing. Not that bad things happened, but that people survived them. That survival was possible even when it seemed impossible. 35 years after that dinner, I was 70. Still running Phoenix Collective, though Violet had taken over most day-to-day operations of the Learning Center. I'd slowed down, finally admitting I couldn't maintain the pace I had for decades. My body reminded me constantly that I was aging. Arthritis made long days difficult. My memory wasn't as sharp, but my passion remained. Every day I worked felt like an act of defiance. Proof that Gabrielle hadn't won, that I'd outlasted the damage and built something enduring. I started writing a memoir, a full accounting of everything that had happened and what I'd learned. My publisher was enthusiastic, seeing potential for both commercial success and social impact. But writing it was harder than I'd anticipated. revisiting every detail, reliving emotions I'd spent decades managing. Some days I wrote thousands of words effortlessly. Other days I stared at blank pages, unable to find language for experiences that still felt overwhelming. The memoir took 3 years to complete. When I finally submitted the manuscript, I felt exhausted and relieved. I'd told the whole truth, the ugly parts and the triumphant parts and everything in between. I'd written about my failures and my victories with equal honesty, about the marriage that ended and the person I'd become, about Gabrielle and what she'd done, and my complicated feelings about her death, about the decades of work that followed, about everything I'd learned about trauma and recovery and the human capacity to survive the unsurvivable. The book published when I was 73, it became an immediate bestseller, not because people wanted to read about suffering, but because people needed to know recovery was possible, that you could lose everything and still build a meaningful life. That trauma didn't have to be a permanent ending. Reviews called it essential reading, raw and honest and ultimately hopeful. I did a book tour, speaking to packed auditoriums. People lined up for hours to tell me their stories, to thank me for giving them hope. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying. At one event, a woman in her 80s approached. She said she'd been falsely accused of theft from the nursing home where she worked 40 years earlier. She'd never recovered professionally, never told anyone the full story. She'd carried the shame silently for 4 decades. Reading my book, she'd finally felt permission to grieve what she'd lost and acknowledge what she'd survived. She thanked me through tears, and I realized that our stories lived on longer than we did, that speaking truth about trauma helped people we'd never meet, that the work mattered beyond anything I could quantify. Violet's children grew. Hope became a teenager with her mother's passion for education and her grandmother's determination. Watching her, I saw the future. A generation that understood trauma differently, that could speak about it openly, that had resources we'd never had. She knew my story intimately. Sometimes she asked questions. What was it like losing everything? Were you ever scared you wouldn't make it? Did you ever want to give up? I answered honestly. Yes, I was terrified. Yes, I wanted to give up constantly. Yes, there were days I didn't think I'd survive. But I had. And that survival had mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone who came after. For her. For the thousands of people whose lives improved because I'd refused to stay destroyed. That had to be worth something. Had to justify the pain. Phoenix Collective's 40th anniversary arrived when I was 79. Too old to run the organization anymore. I'd passed leadership to younger people who understood modern challenges in ways I couldn't. But I attended the anniversary celebration, now a week-long conference with programming tracks and workshops and networking events. Over 10,000 people participated. The scale was incomprehensible. What started as my desperate need to process trauma had become a global movement. During the closing ceremony, they announced a new initiative, the Gabrielle Warning System, a database where people could report individuals engaged in systematic harassment and false allegations. Not a public shaming platform, but a confidential resource for background checks and pattern recognition, designed to stop people like Gabrielle before they destroyed more lives. Named after her not as honor, but as warning, as reminder of what unchecked damage looked like. I sat in the audience crying while they explained the system. This was what I'd wanted from the beginning, a way to protect others, to stop the cycle. It had taken 40 years, but we'd finally created something that might prevent the next person from experiencing what I had. That felt like completion, like the circle had closed, like maybe finally the work was done. Except the work was never done. New people needed help constantly. New policies required advocacy. New survivors needed mentoring. The work would continue long after I was gone. That was both comforting and overwhelming. I'd started something that had grown beyond me, that would exist independently of my continued involvement. That was its own kind of immortality. I wrote a letter to be opened after my death, addressed to Phoenix Collective members, thanking them for letting me be part of something meaningful, for taking my trauma and helping transform it into something that helped others, for proving that the worst things didn't have to be endings, that communities could form around shared survival, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. I sealed the letter and gave it to Violet with instructions. Approaching 80, I started divesting myself of responsibilities, stepping down from boards, declining speaking engagements, simplifying my life. I wanted my final years to be peaceful, to be about rest and reflection rather than constant advocacy. I'd earned that. Decades of fighting entitled me to lay down the burden. Others would carry it forward. I could finally rest. But rest proved harder than expected. My identity had been so tied to the work. Without it, who was I? Just an old woman with trauma in her past? Or something more? I struggled with purpose. Therapy helped. My therapist reminded me that I'd done enough, that my value wasn't tied to productivity, that I could simply exist without justifying my existence through constant achievement. It took time to believe her. I spent more time with Violet's family, became the grandmother who always had time, who never rushed. I taught Hope to read using the same methods I'd used with her mother decades earlier, watched her eyes light up when words finally clicked. That same magic I'd seen in thousands of students. The reminder that learning was possible, that growth was possible, that change was possible. On the 40th anniversary of that dinner, I sat alone in my apartment thinking about everything that had happened. The woman I'd been before, the woman I'd become after, the decades of work and healing and fighting, the life I'd lost and the life I'd built, the pain that never fully disappeared and the joy I'd fought to reclaim. All of it felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light at the same time. I thought about Gabrielle, dead for over a decade now. The woman who'd destroyed my life and inadvertently given me purpose. I felt nothing about her anymore. No anger, no grief, no curiosity, just indifference. She'd been a person who'd hurt me badly. That was the whole story. Everything after was mine. My choices, my work, my recovery. She'd caused the initial damage, but I'd determined what came next. That felt like power. Like maybe I'd won after all. 40 years. Almost exactly as long as my entire life before that dinner. I'd now lived more years after the trauma than before it. That seemed significant. Like I'd finally outrun it. Like it was part of my history but not my present. Like I could finally just be without the constant weight of what had happened. That felt like freedom. Incomplete, complicated freedom. But freedom nonetheless. I poured myself wine. Not the expensive kind Gabrielle had brought. Just cheap wine I liked. I raised a glass to my younger self. The woman who'd opened the door that night. Who'd trusted when she shouldn't have. Who'd survived when survival seemed impossible. Who'd built something beautiful from absolute ruins. I told her I was proud of her. That she'd done better than she knew. That everything turned out okay. Not perfect. Not how she'd planned. But okay. And that was enough. Letting my husband's ex into our house that night destroyed everything. Just not in the way she planned. She'd meant to ruin me. Instead, she'd forced me to become someone stronger than I'd ever been. Someone purposeful and determined and capable of building something meaningful from disaster. The worst thing that ever happened to me had become the foundation for my best work. That was the truth I'd finally made peace with. Not that it was worth it. Never that. But that it had meaning. And sometimes, meaning was enough.